The wind sweeping down from the Sangre de Cristo mountains did not merely blow. It bit. It had teeth, sharp and invisible, gnawing at the exposed skin of anyone foolish enough to be out on the high plateau of New Mexico in late November of the year 1878. Clara Wynne adjusted the heavy leather strap across her forehead, the weight of the piñon wood digging into her spine. She was bent nearly double, a solitary figure moving against the gray backdrop of a sky threatening snow. Around her, the scrub brush rattled like dry bones. Down in the hollow, the settlement of Thorns Crossing huddled against the elements. It was not much of a town, merely a collection of timber structures clinging to the trade route like barnacles on a ship's hull. There was the general store, the livery stable, a small clapboard church with a peeling white cross, and the saloon that smelled perpetually of stale beer and unwashed bodies. Clara kept her eyes on the frozen mud of the path. She knew what they called her down there. She could hear the whispers even when the wind was howling. The Winter Virgin. Sometimes they called her the Snow Virgin. It was not a compliment. It was a title spoken with a sneer by the women whose bellies had swelled with children they could not feed, and with a lecherous curiosity by the men who spent their wages on whiskey and the painted women in the back rooms of the saloon. To them, Clara was an oddity. She was 22 years old, an age by which most women on the frontier were already worn down by childbirth and grief. Yet here she was, unattached, belonging to no man, hauling wood like a mule to keep a dying father warm. She reached the crest of the hill. Their cabin sat apart from the rest of the settlement, a small, stubborn structure with a roof that leaked and walls that groaned in the gale. It was isolated, much like Clara herself. She dropped the bundle of wood near the chopping block. Her hands were raw, the knuckles split and bleeding despite the tallow she rubbed into them every night. She blew on them, watching her breath plume in the frigid air, before gathering an armful of the smaller kindling to take inside. The heat hit her the moment she opened the heavy oak door, but it was a thin, smoky heat that barely touched the chill in the corners of the room. Clara. The voice was thin, rattling like dry leaves in a gust. Elias Wynne sat in his rocking chair by the hearth, a blanket wrapped tightly around his wasted legs. He had been a tall man once, a soldier who had ridden with the cavalry to subdue the tribes of the territory. Now, he was a husk. The injury to his hip from a horse fall years ago had crippled his body, but it was the sickness in his lungs that was slowly killing him. "I am here, Papa," Clara said, kicking the door shut with her heel. She moved efficiently, kneeling to feed the fire. "The wind is picking up. We will have snow before morning." Elias coughed, a wet, hacking sound that ended in a wheeze. He wiped his mouth with a stained handkerchief. "You should not be out there, girl. Not with the weather turning. It is not right. The wood does not walk itself to the fire." "Papa?" Clara replied gently. She did not look at him, focusing instead on the flames licking at the dry bark. "And we cannot afford to pay the Mexican boys from the valley to haul it this year." "I should be doing it," Elias muttered, his gaze drifting to the old cavalry saber hanging above the mantel. It was rusting, just like him. A man should provide heat for his house. "You provide the house," Clara said, standing up and brushing the bark dust from her apron. "I just keep it warm." She went to the small table where a basin of water waited. She needed to wash the resin from her hands before she started supper. They had salt pork and beans again, perhaps a little cornmeal if the mice had not gotten into the sack. The sound of hoofbeats outside made them both freeze. It was not the erratic rhythm of a traveler passing through, but the heavy, deliberate plodding of a large horse. Clara exchanged a look with her father. "Stay seated," she whispered. The knock on the door was authoritative. Before Clara could answer, the latch lifted, and the door swung open. Silas Thorne filled the doorway. He was a bear of a man, wrapped in a buffalo hide coat that must have cost $50, a fortune in these parts. His face was broad and red from the cold, his beard trimmed into a neat spade that failed to hide the weakness of his chin. As the owner of the trading post and the man who held the mortgage on nearly every soul in Thorns Crossing, Silas moved with the confidence of a landlord inspecting his property. Good evening. Elias. Miss Clara, Silas said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He brought the smell of tobacco and expensive bay rum with him, masking the scent of the wood smoke. Mr. Thorne, Clara said, her voice cool. She did not wipe her hands. She stood between him and her father, a subtle barricade. I brought you something, Silas said. Reaching into the deep pocket of his coat, he pulled out a small sack of white flour fine, milled flour, not the coarse grit they usually ate. He set it on the table with a heavy thud. Thought you might want biscuits that don't break your teeth this winter. Elias shifted in his chair, his pride warring with his hunger. We have not settled the account for the last month. Silas, I cannot take more on credit. Silas waved a hand, a gesture of dismissal that was more insulting than reassuring. Money is a concern for strangers. Elias, we are neighbors, friends. His eyes slid to Clara, lingering on the curve of her neck, the flush of cold still on her cheeks. Besides, I hate to think of a delicate flower like Clara eating hardtack. Clara felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the draft. My teeth are strong enough. Mr. Thorne. Silas chuckled, a low sound that vibrated in the small room. Strong, yes, but stubborn. You know, Elias, I was speaking with the doctor in Santa Fe last week. He says a man with your condition needs consistent warmth, good food, rest. Not a drafty cabin on a windswept hill. He moved a step closer to Clara. She could smell the whiskey on his breath now. If you were to merge your interests with mine, Silas said, his voice dropping to a silky purr, your father would never feel the cold again. The room behind the trading post has a cast iron stove that burns all night, and servants carry the wood. It was the same trap he laid every time he visited. The gilded cage. Marry him, and the debt disappears. Marry him, and her father lives in comfort. Marry him, and she becomes another possession in his inventory, right next to the beaver pelts and the barrels of whiskey. We are managing, Clara said, her chin lifting. The winter does not frighten us. Silas's eyes hardened for a fraction of a second before the jovial mask slipped back into place. Winter is long, my dear, and it has barely begun. He turned to Elias. Think about it, old friend. I can only hold the wolves at bay for so long. The army is cutting back on contracts. Prices are going up. He tipped his beaver felt hat. Good evening. When the door closed, the silence in the cabin was heavier than before. Clara stared at the sack of flour as if it were a rattlesnake coiled on the table. He is right, Elias said softly. Clara spun around. Papa? He is right, Elias repeated, his voice cracking. I am a burden. You are wasting your youth nursing a dying man and hauling wood like a mule. Silas is a hard man, but he has means. You would be safe. Safe. Clara walked to the fire and jabbed at the logs with the iron poker, sending sparks flying. He wants to own us. He looks at me the way he looks at a prize mare. I would rather freeze than warm his bed. Elias closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the chair. I have sins, Clara, terrible sins. When I wore the uniform, God, the things we did to the Navajo, the villages we burned so they would have no shelter in the winter. We drove them like cattle. He opened his eyes, staring into the flames. Maybe this is my punishment, to watch my own daughter suffer the cold I forced on others. Stop it, Clara said fiercely, kneeling beside him and taking his cold hand. You were a soldier following orders. That was a lifetime ago. The Navajo are still out there, Elias whispered. I hear them. Silas says they are stealing cattle again. He says the general is planning a sweep to clear the mountains once and for all. If war comes back here, a woman alone. I am not alone, Clara said, squeezing his hand. And I am not afraid of Silas Thorne or his rumors. But she was. Fear was a cold stone in her stomach, heavier than the wood she carried. Sunday morning brought a sky the color of bruised iron. The bell of the community church tolled, a bleak sound that seemed to be swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. Reverend Pike stood at the pulpit, a man who looked as though he had been carved from tallow. He was soft, pale, and sweated even in the winter. His eyes, however, were sharp, darting around the congregation to catalog sins. Clara sat in the second pew, her back straight, her hands folded primly in her lap. She could feel the eyes on her. The townspeople looked at her not with kindness, but with expectation. She was the vessel of their morality, because she had no husband, no scandal, and dedicated herself to her invalid father. They projected their own need for purity onto her. It was exhausting. "And we must be vigilant," Reverend Pike's voice boomed, bouncing off the rough-hewn beams. "The wilderness is not merely a place of trees and rocks. It is the abode of the tempter. The savage lurks in the shadows, rejecting the light of civilization, rejecting the laws of God." He paused for dramatic effect, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "We hear rumors of unrest. The heathen tribes, the Navajo who refuse the reservation, prowl our borders. They covet our lands. They covet our women." A ripple of murmured agreement went through the room. Clara saw Mrs. Miller, the baker's wife, glance at her with a mixture of pity and warning. "But we must remain pure," Pike continued, his gaze landing heavily on Clara. "We must be like the virgin snow, untouched by the filth of the savage world. A woman's virtue is the shield of her home. If she falters, if she allows the darkness to touch her, the foundation of our society crumbles." Clara felt her face burning. He was using her. He was holding her up as the standard, the winter virgin who sacrificed her happiness for duty, implying that any deviation would be a betrayal of them all. Silas Thorne sat in the front pew, nodding solemnly. He turned slightly, catching Clara's eye. He smiled, a possessive, knowing smile. He knew the pressure she was under. He was counting on it to break her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and shout that she was not a symbol. She was a woman of flesh and blood who was tired and lonely and scared. But she sat still. She was Clara Wynne. She endured. That night, the air was so clear it felt brittle, as if the slightest movement might shatter the world like glass. The moon was a sliver of ice in the sky. Clara stood in the yard behind the cabin, the heavy axe in her hands. Ideally, one chopped wood in the daylight. But the days were short, and the need for fuel was endless. Besides, this was the only time she was truly alone. No staring townspeople. No coughing father, just the rhythm of the swing and the impact. Thwack! The blade split the pine log cleanly. The scent of sap rose in the cold air, sharp and clean. Thwack! She worked with a fury that frightened her. She was chopping away the Reverend's sermon, chopping away Silas Thorne's oily smile, chopping away the look of resignation in her father's eyes. She paused to catch her breath, leaning on the handle of the axe. Her breath clouded around her face. Then she heard it. It was faint, carried on the wind from the dark, jagged silhouette of the mountains to the west, a rhythmic, low thrumming. Bum, 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 bum. Drums. The people in town locked their doors when they heard that sound. They loaded their Winchesters and prayed. But Clara stood frozen, listening. It did not sound like a war cry. It sounded like a heartbeat. It sounded steady, ancient, and enduring. Her father had told her stories of the Navajo, the Dinah. He spoke of them with fear and guilt, but also with a strange reverence for their connection to the land. They believed the mountains were living bones of the earth. Out there, in the darkness, there were people who did not care about Reverend Pike's sermons or Silas Thorne's ledgers, people who lived by the wind and the stars. For a terrifying, exhilarating moment, Clara wished she could simply walk into that darkness and never come back. She shook her head, dispelling the fancy. Dreams did not keep the fire burning. She gathered the split logs, stacking them onto the canvas sling she used to haul them to the storage shed attached to the side of the cabin. It was a heavy load, perhaps 60 pounds or more. Too much for one trip, really. But she was angry and impatient. She hoisted the bundle onto her back, gritting her teeth against the strain. The path to the shed was narrow, sloping downward along the edge of a shallow ravine that served as a drainage ditch for the spring melt. Ice had formed on the path, hidden beneath a dusting of fresh powder snow. Clara took a step. Her boot found no purchase. It happened in a heartbeat. Her foot slid out, shooting sideways. The heavy bundle of wood shifted violently, throwing her center of gravity off. She flailed, twisting her body to avoid being crushed by the wood. But momentum was a cruel master. She fell hard, the breath driven from her lungs. She began to slide toward the edge of the ravine. The drop was not sheer, but it was steep and lined with jagged rocks. If she went over, she would break a leg, or worse. "Help!" The cry was torn from her throat, weak and swallowed by the wind. She clawed at the frozen earth, her fingernails tearing, but she kept sliding. The black maw of the ravine opened up beneath her. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the bone-shattering impact. Suddenly, her wrist was seized. It was not a frantic grab, but a clamp of iron. The grip was impossibly strong, halting her slide with a jolt that nearly dislocated her shoulder. Clara gasped, her eyes flying open. She was dangling over the edge, her boots scrabbling against loose shell. Above her, kneeling on the rim of the ravine, was a shadow. He was a part of the night itself. The moonlight caught the angle of a high cheekbone and the flash of eyes that were dark, alert, and fiercely alive. He was not a man from the town. His hair was long, black as a raven's wing, falling loose over shoulders covered in buckskin rather than wool. Heat radiated from his hand, a searing, vital warmth that penetrated through her frozen skin. He did not speak. He simply pulled, with a grunt of effort that seemed to come from the earth itself. He hauled her up and over the lip of the ravine as easily as if she were a doll. Clara collapsed onto the snow, gasping for air, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The bundle of firewood had tumbled down into the darkness, crashing against the rocks below. She looked up, trembling, prepared to see a ghost or a monster from the Reverend's sermons. The stranger stood over her. He was tall, lithe, and powerful. He wore the dress of a Navajo warrior, but there was no war paint on his face, only a solemn intensity. He looked at her, then at the empty path where the wood had been, and then back to her. He did not look like a savage. He looked like the mountain itself had taken human form to catch her. And for the first time in her life, the winter virgin was not cold. The imprint of his hand on her wrist burned like a brand. Clara's breath hitched in her throat, a sharp intake of freezing air that preceded a scream. It was an instinct, primal and overwhelming, born of the shadow looming over her and the terrifying fall she had just survived. But the sound never left her lips. A hand, large and calloused but surprisingly warm, pressed firmly against her mouth. It smelled of wood smoke, cured leather, and the faint, sweet scent of crushed sagebrush. It was not the smell of the saloon or the sour sweat of the coal miners. It was the scent of the high desert itself. "Do not fear," a voice whispered, the words low and vibrating against her cheek. The English was heavily accented, the vowels elongated and soft, like stones polished by a river current. "It is just wood. Little bird." Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped sparrow. She looked up, her eyes adjusting to the gloom of the ravine. The stranger did not pin her down. He did not hurt her. The moment he felt her panic subside, he pulled his hand away slowly, showing her his open palm as a sign of peace. He moved with a fluid grace that defied the treacherous, icy footing of the slope. Without a word, he turned and descended further into the dark belly of the ravine where her burden had fallen. Clara scrambled to her knees, watching in disbelief. A normal man would struggle to lift the bundle she had packed. It was wet pine, heavy and awkward. The stranger reached down, grabbed the thick hemp ropes binding the logs, and hoisted the entire bundle onto one shoulder as if it weighed no more than a sack of feathers. He climbed back up the slope, his moccasined feet finding purchase on rocks that had sent Clara tumbling. He dropped the wood gently on the snow beside her, not 3 feet away. Now, in the pale, reflected light of the moon against the snow, she saw him clearly. He was not a ghost. He was a man, perhaps 25 or 26 years old. He wore a tunic of buckskin that hugged broad shoulders, darkened by wear and weather. Silver ornaments glinted at his ears, and a small turquoise amulet hung from a leather thong around his neck. But it was his eyes that held her obsidian dark, deep and unreadable, yet lacking the cruel glint she had seen in the eyes of soldiers who passed through the trading post. On his left wrist, just below the cuff of his shirt, a jagged pale scar traced a line across his copper skin. Navajo. The word rang in her mind with the force of a church bell. The Reverend Pike called them godless heathens. The soldiers called them hostiles. The townspeople called them savages. Yet this savage had just caught her from falling and retrieved her wood. "I am Talon Nez," he said, his voice calm, cutting through the wind. He gestured vaguely toward the south. "I only passed this way to retrieve a stash of salt I left in the cave 2 seasons ago. I did not mean to frighten you." A corner of his mouth twitched, a ghost of a smile appearing. "Your wood decided to roll onto my path. Perhaps it wanted to travel south as well." Clara stared at him, her mouth slightly open. He was joking. A Navajo warrior, standing in the freezing dark within rifle range of a trading post that would hang him on sight, was making a joke about firewood. Clara stammered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shivering shoulders. "I slipped." "The ice cares not who walks upon it," Talon Nez replied. He studied her for a moment, his gaze sweeping over her frayed coat and her red, trembling hands. Suddenly, a memory surfaced in Clara's mind, a whispered conversation she had overheard between Mrs. Gable, the elderly widow who lived on the edge of the settlement, and the baker. Mrs. Gable had claimed that during the last blizzard, when her rheumatism was so bad she could not lift an axe, she had woken to find her wood box filled and fresh kindling stacked on her porch. She had called it a miracle. The children in town whispered of a shadow that moved in the storm, a spirit that did not hate, but watched. Clara looked at the man before her. "It was you," she whispered, the realization dawning bright and shocking. "Mrs. Gable's porch, the wood. You are the one they talk about." Talon did not answer, but his expression shifted, a flicker of guardedness entering his eyes. He shifted his weight, his ears pricking up like those of a wolf. "Hush," he commanded softly. Clara heard it then, too. The crunch of hooves on frozen crust, the jingle of a bridle, voices loud and aggressive, carrying from the top of the ridge. "I saw tracks over here. Silas," a rough voice shouted. "Fresh ones. Maybe a coyote. Maybe a 2-legged rat." It was one of the hired hands Silas Thorne kept on his payroll men, who were essentially thugs with badges pinned to their coats. And then came the voice that made Clara's stomach turn over. "Check the ravine," Silas Thorne ordered. "If the Navajo are stealing my cattle, they will likely use the wash to move them. Keep your Winchesters ready." Clara looked at Talon. The humor was gone from his face. He was pure tension now, a coiled spring ready to snap. He looked at the steep bank behind him, then at Clara. He stepped closer, invading her space, his voice a mere breath against the howling wind. "If you scream," he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that paralyzed her. "The soldiers come. They shoot first. We both die in the snow." He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "If you are silent," he continued, "I vanish like smoke. The choice is yours, Snow Woman." Clara looked up the slope. She could see the bobbing light of a lantern now. Silas was coming. If he found a Navajo warrior here, with her, the violence would be immediate. They would kill Talon, and then, what would they say about her, a white woman alone in the dark with a savage? Her reputation, her safety, her father's fragile peace, it would all be incinerated. She looked back at Talon. He was waiting. He did not look like he was begging for his life. He looked like he was assessing whether she was a threat to be neutralized. Clara made her choice. She grabbed the bundle of wood Talon had retrieved and shoved it violently toward the path, letting it crash against the brush. Then she began to stomp around in the snow, kicking at the drift where Talon stood. effectively blurring the distinct outline of his moccasin prints with the chaotic scuff marks of her own boots. "Stupid ice!" she shouted, her voice shrill and convincing. "Stupid, useless boots!" She turned her back on Talon, blocking him from the line of sight of the approaching lantern. She bent over the wood, pretending to struggle with the knot. Behind her, she heard the faintest sound, a rustle of fabric, the snap of a twig, and then nothing. The absence of him was sudden and total. "Who goes there?" Silas's voice boomed from the top of the ridge. The beam of the lantern swung down, blinding Clara. She shielded her eyes with a hand, squinting up into the glare. "It is me, Mr. Thorn. Do not shoot unless you plan to execute me for clumsiness." Silas slid his horse down the embankment, the animal snorting and tossing its head. Two other riders waited on the ridge, rifles resting on their saddles. Silas leaned down from his saddle, the leather of it creaking. "Clara," he sounded suspicious, his gaze darting around the ravine. "What in God's name are you doing in a ditch at this hour? I heard voices." "You heard me cursing the ground I walk on." Clara lied, her heart thumping so hard she feared he could hear it over the wind. She stood up, brushing snow from her skirt. "I slipped. My wood fell. I had to go down and fetch it." Silas frowned, lowering the lantern. The light washed over the disturbed snow. Thanks to Clara's frantic kicking, it looked like nothing more than the scene of a bad fall. There were no clear prints leading away into the darkness. "You take foolish risks," Silas scolded, though his tone softened into that patronizing familiarity she loathed. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground, his heavy boots crunching on the ice. He walked toward her, looming large and smelling of stale tobacco. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "Just my pride," Clara said, taking a step back. She did not want him near her. Silas reached out and snatched her hand before she could retreat further. He held it up to the lantern light. Clara's hand was a mess red, swollen from the cold. The skin across her knuckles cracked and oozing a tiny bead of blood. It looked raw and painful, a stark contrast to Silas's gloved hand holding it. "Look at this," Silas murmured, shaking his head. His thumb brushed over her raw skin, not with tenderness, but with a strange, possessive curiosity. "Rough as a washboard. This is a shame, Clara, a crying shame." He looked into her eyes, his face dangerously close. "These hands, they are small, delicate. They were not made to carry timber like a beast of burden." Clara tried to pull her hand away, but his grip tightened just enough to be a warning. "Winter is coming. Clara," Silas whispered, his voice oily. "The snow will be deep this year, 6 feet, maybe 7. A woman alone cannot fight it. You should be carrying gold on this finger, not pine logs on your back." The implication hung in the air, suffocating. He wasn't offering help. He was offering a transaction. Her freedom for his protection, her body for his warmth. "My hands are stronger than they look. Mr. Thorn," Clara said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. She yanked her hand back with sudden force. This time, he let her go. Silas stared at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. He looked past her, into the darkness of the ravine. For a second, Clara thought he saw something, a shadow, a movement, but he merely grunted. "Have it your way," Silas said, turning back to his horse. He mounted with a groan of effort. But when the wolves howl, "Remember who offered you a door to lock?" He signaled to his men. "Let us go. Nothing here but a stubborn girl in the cold." They rode off, the lantern light bobbing away until it disappeared over the ridge. Clara stood frozen, listening until the hoofbeats faded completely into the wind. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, her knees suddenly weak. She sank down onto the bundle of wood, burying her face in her hands. A soft thud made her look up. Talon Nez stepped out from behind a cluster of scrub oak not 10 feet away. He had been there the whole time, blended so perfectly with the night that he might have been a rock or a shadow. In his hand, he held a single piece of kindling, a piece of split birch that must have fallen from her bundle when Silas arrived. He walked forward silently and placed it gently on top of her stack. He has the eyes of a snake, That one, Talon said quietly. There was no judgment in his voice, only a statement of fact. Clara looked at him. She felt exposed, ashamed that he had witnessed Silas's humiliation of her, yet strangely comforted that she was not alone. He owns the town, Clara said bitterly. Or he thinks he does. Talon looked at her hands, the one Silas had inspected with such disdain. Then he looked at the massive bundle of wood she was preparing to lift again. You carry too much for 2 hands, he said. A small, wry smile touched his lips again, echoing his earlier joke, but his eyes were serious. Even for a stubborn snow woman. Clara stood up, grabbing the ropes of her burden. She felt the sting of her cracked knuckles, the ache in her back, the crushing weight of her father's illness and Silas's threats. If I do not carry it, she said, looking straight into the warrior's dark eyes. Who will keep my father warm? Who will keep the frost from his lungs? The question hung between them. It was a declaration of defiance, a rejection of Silas's pity and the town's scorn. Talon Nez stared at her. Something shifted in his expression. The amusement vanished, replaced by a flicker of respect or perhaps recognition. He knew what it was to carry a burden for others. He knew what it was to fight a winter that wanted to kill his people. Fire is heavy, Talon said softly. But the cold is heavier. He stepped back, melting into the shadows of the ravine wall. Walk well. Clara Wynne. The wolves are out tonight, but they are not the ones on 4 legs. Before she could answer, before she could ask why he had stayed, he turned and sprinted up the far side of the ravine, silent and swift, disappearing into the vast, indifferent night. 2 miles away, in the warm, lamp-lit office of the Fort Union outpost, Silas Thorne stood before a large map pinned to the wall. He poured 2 glasses of brandy, the crystal clinking softly in the quiet room. Major Higgins, a man with a thick mustache and tired eyes, sat behind the desk, reviewing a ledger. You are certain, Silas? The major asked, accepting the glass. Mobilizing a patrol in this weather is no small thing. The horses take a beating. Silas took a sip of the brandy, savoring the burn. He thought of Clara's defiant face. He thought of the mysterious tracks in the ravine that he had pretended not to see, tracks that were too soft to be boots. He thought of the cattle he had lost last week likely to wolves. But that didn't matter. He needed leverage. He needed fear. Fear made people desperate. Desperate people made deals. Desperate women sought protection. I am certain, Major. Silas lied smoothly, his voice grave. I saw signs near the ravine tonight. Scouts. They are testing our perimeter. The Navajo are not just looters. They are probing for a weakness. I believe they are planning a raid on the winter stores. The major frowned, tapping his pen against the desk. If they hit the stores, the settlement starves. Exactly, Silas said, leaning forward, his shadow stretching long across the map. We cannot wait for them to strike. We need to secure the area. We need more men, Major, and we need to clear those hills. I will wire Santa Fe in the morning, the major said, his face hardening. We will authorize a sweep. Silas smiled into his glass. Excellent. Best to be safe. Major, the wilderness is a dangerous place for the innocent. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the first flakes of the storm, burying the truth under a layer of white silence. The first blizzard of the season did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with a scream. By the time a week had passed since the incident in the ravine, the sky had lowered itself onto the plateau like a ceiling of gray iron. The wind stripped the last dead leaves from the cottonwoods and scoured the earth until it was hard as bone. Clara Wynne stood at the edge of the timberline, the wind whipping her skirts around her legs. She had told her father she was checking the rabbit snares, but there were no rabbits in this weather. In her arms, she held 3 pieces of split oak, the best wood, dried and dense, meant for a long burn. She felt a flush of heat rise up her neck that had nothing to do with exertion. What she was doing was foolish. It was worse than foolish. It was improper. A decent Christian woman did not leave gifts in the snow for a savage warrior. The Reverend Pike would call it consorting with darkness. Silas Thorne would call it treason. Yet, she walked to the cluster of boulders near the drop-off where she had met Talon Nez. She wedged the wood into a dry crevice, protected from the coming snow. "Just payment," she muttered to the empty air, trying to convince herself. "He carried my load. I am returning the favor." But as she turned to leave, the storm broke. It was not a gradual onset. A wall of white slammed into the mountain, erasing the horizon instantly. The temperature plummeted, freezing the moisture in her nose with a sharp pinch. The wind roared, a physical weight that shoved her sideways. Clara stumbled, blinded. She tried to retrace her steps to the cabin, but the world had become a featureless void of swirling white. She pushed forward, her hands outstretched, but her boot caught on a buried root. She fell hard, the breath driven from her lungs. When she tried to stand, the wind battered her back down, piling snow over her legs as if trying to bury her alive. "Get up!" she hissed through chattering teeth. "Get up! Clara!" She managed to rise to her knees, disoriented. Which way was the cabin, left, right? Every direction looked the same. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in her chest. Then, the white curtain parted. A figure emerged from the storm, not 5 feet away. He moved low to the ground, braced against the gale. Before Clara could cry out, strong hands gripped her shoulders. "You possess the survival instincts of a newborn fawn," a deep voice growled near her ear. Talon Nez hauled her to her feet. He did not ask if she was all right. He simply took over. He grabbed the heavy wool shawl that was whipping uselessly around her neck and pulled it tight over her head, shielding her face. "Move," he commanded. "The wind will strip the flesh from your bones if we stay here." He did not lead her toward the cabin. It was too far, and the visibility was 0. Instead, he pulled her toward the rim of the ravine, guiding her down a treacherous goat path she had never noticed before. They slid and scrambled until they reached an overhang of sandstone, a shallow cave carved by wind and water over centuries. Talon pushed her into the recess. The roar of the wind instantly dulled to a low moan outside. It was dry here and dark, smelling of dust and animal musk. Clara sank against the cold stone wall, shivering violently. Her teeth clattered together so hard her jaw ached. "Sit," Talon ordered. He moved to the back of the niche where a small pile of dry brush and sage was stacked. He had prepared this place, with flint and steel, and a patience that maddened her. He struck a spark. A small flame caught the dry tinder, blooming into a fragile orange light. He turned to her, unfastening a heavy buffalo robe from his shoulders. Without asking, he draped it over her, the fur thick and retaining the heat of his body. "You will break every bone in your body before winter truly settles," Talon said, squatting by the fire. He fed it a handful of twisted juniper branches. "Why were you out there?" Clara pulled the robe tighter, the scent of wood smoke and leather enveloping her. It was an intimate scent, masculine and wild. I brought wood, for the fire." Talon looked at her, the firelight dancing in his obsidian eyes. "You brought wood to the edge of the canyon. Do you plan to heat the whole valley?" Clara Wynne. He used her name. It sounded strange on his tongue, the consonant softer than when the townspeople said it. "I left it for you," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "In the crevice, to pay you back for the other night." Talon stopped tending the fire. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You risked freezing to death to pay a debt of 3 logs. He shook his head, a faint smile touching his lips. "White people have strange laws." "It is not a law," Clara defended, feeling the blood return to her cheeks. "It is gratitude. Gratitude keeps no one alive," Talon said. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a strip of dried meat, breaking it in half and offering a piece to her. "Eat. It will warm the blood." Clara took it hesitantly. It was hard and salty, but she chewed it obediently. "My father," she began, needing to fill the silence, needing to explain why she was so desperate to prove herself capable. "He is sick. The cold hurts him. I have to be the one to provide." "The old soldier," Talon said. It was not a question. "I have seen him sitting on the porch in the summers." He walks with a limp. He was a translator, Clara said quickly, defensive. For the army, he did not carry a rifle often. Tongues can kill as efficiently as bullets, Talon said, his voice devoid of anger but heavy with memory. Words draw lines on maps. Words tell soldiers where the water is. Clara looked down at the fire. He regrets it. He has nightmares. He told me they drove your people into the snow. They did, Talon said. He stared into the flames, his face hardening into a mask of sorrow. My mother died on that walk, but my father took me and ran into the mountains. We became ghosts to keep our blood alive. He looked up at Clara, and the intensity of his gaze pinned her to the stone wall. And now, your Silas Thorne wants to finish what the soldiers started, Talon said. He does not just want the land. Clara, he wants the spring that runs through the canyon below. It is the only water that does not freeze in the deep winter. If he takes it, my people die, or we surrender to the reservation. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. He says you are stealing cattle. We take what we need to survive when the game is gone, Talon said unapologetically. But Thorne wants the water for a tannery. He wants to poison the stream to make leather for boots in the east. Clara stared at him. A tannery. Silas had mentioned industry to the town council, using big words about progress. He hadn't mentioned poisoning the water. She looked at this man, this savage who sat across the fire from her. He was not the monster Reverend Pike described. He was a man fighting for his home, just as she was fighting for hers. The line between them, drawn by church and state, began to blur. "Why do you tell me this?" she asked. "I am one of them. Are you?" Talon asked softly. He reached out and adjusted the buffalo robe where it had slipped from her shoulder. His fingers brushed her neck, a fleeting touch that sent a shock wave through her body. "You carry your own wood. You walk in the storm. You are not like the women who hide behind glass windows." Clara's heart hammered. For years, she had been defined by what she lacked: a husband, a fortune, a completed family. Talon looked at her and saw what she had: strength. The storm lasted 2 days. When Clara finally returned to the cabin, slipping in quietly while her father slept, nothing was the same. The town of Thorne's Crossing emerged from the snow, buried and silent. But the whispers began almost immediately. Mrs. Pike, the Reverend's wife, caught Clara outside the general store 3 days later. The woman was shaped like a pigeon and possessed the same inquisitiveness. "We missed you at the quilting circle. Clara?" "Mrs." Pike said, her eyes narrowing as she scanned Clara's face. "And I saw no smoke from your chimney on the morning of the storm. I worried you might have wandered." "I was tending to the cracks in the walls, Mrs. Pike," Clara lied, clutching her basket of dry beans. "The wind was fierce." "Indeed." Mrs. Pike sniffed. "Though some say the wind carries the scent of wild things into town. You should be careful. Child, a woman's reputation is like fresh snow. Once muddied, it never turns white again." Clara walked away, her spine stiff, but the words stung. They were watching her. They were waiting for her to fall. That evening, the tension broke inside her own home. Clara brought in the evening wood, stomping the snow from her boots. Elias sat in his chair, cleaning his old service revolver, a habit he had taken up again since Silas's warnings about the raids. As Clara dropped the logs into the bin, Elias leaned forward. His eyes, usually clouded with pain and laudanum, were suddenly sharp. "Bring that here," he commanded, pointing to a piece of cedar she had just put down. Clara hesitated. "It is just wood. Papa." "Bring it," Elias barked. Clara picked up the journal and carried it to him. Elias took it, his trembling fingers tracing the rough bark. He pulled something from a snag in the wood. It was a small strip of red cloth, wool, dyed with cochineal and woven in a distinct, jagged pattern. It was a piece of a Navajo blanket likely torn from Talon's sleeve when he had gathered the wood for her days ago. Elias held the scrap up to the firelight. The silence in the room was deafening. "Where did you get this wood, Clara?" Elias asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I found it near the ridge," Clara said, her heart racing. "This is Dinah weaving," Elias said, using the native word. He looked at her, his eyes full of fear and a strange, haunted recognition. "I know this pattern. It belongs to the clans of the High Mesa, the ones who refuse to surrender." He gripped the arm of his chair. "Has one of them been here? Have you seen them?" Clara looked at her father. She saw the fear in him not for himself, but for her. He remembered what soldiers did to Navajo women. He assumed the Navajo would do the same to his daughter in retaliation. "I fell," Clara said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "In the ravine, before the storm. A man. He helped me up. He carried the wood to the path. That is all." Elias stared at her. "He touched you? He helped me?" Clara insisted, her voice firm. "He did not hurt me. Papa, he was kind." Elias crumpled slightly. He looked at the red thread, then threw it into the fire. He watched it burn, the tiny flame turning green and blue for a second. "Silas says they are monsters," Elias whispered. "But I remember we burned their cornfields while their children watched." He looked up at Clara, tears standing in his eyes. "Do not tell Silas. If he knows a brave man was this close to you, he will bring the cavalry down on them. He will kill them all." "I won't," Clara promised. "And do not go back there," Elias begged. "Promise me. Clara, stay away from the ridge." Clara nodded, but she crossed her fingers beneath her apron. 2 nights later, the temperature dropped so low the timber of the cabin groaned like a living thing in pain. The air was crystalline, freezing the moisture in the lungs with every breath. Clara was at the woodpile again. The supply was dwindling faster than she had calculated. She was tired. Her hands were a mess of chilblains and open cracks. Every time she gripped the rough bark of the pine, the skin across her knuckles split further, weeping blood that froze almost instantly. She hoisted a bundle onto her shoulder, biting her lip to keep from crying out. The pain was a sharp, throbbing rhythm in her hands. "Stop!" She did not jump this time. She knew the voice. Talon stepped from the darkness of the trees. He moved without sound, a spirit of the winter night. He wore a heavy coat of wolf fur now, his breath pluming in the silver moonlight. He walked straight to her and lifted the bundle from her shoulder, tossing it aside into the snow as if it were garbage. "My father needs," Clara began. "Your father needs a daughter with hands that work." Talon interrupted gently. He stepped closer, blocking the wind with his body. He reached out and took her hands in his. Clara flinched, expecting pain, but his grip was tender. He looked down at her hands. They were raw, angry, red, and smeared with fresh blood where the dry skin had burst. "You destroy yourself for them," Talon murmured. "Every winter, you carry the fire, but you let yourself freeze." He raised her hands to his face. Clara stopped breathing. His eyes never left hers, dark and intense, stripping away her defenses. He blew on her fingers, his breath hot and moist, a shocking contrast to the biting air. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head. He pressed his lips to her knuckles. It was not a chaste peck of greeting. It was a lingering, searing contact. He kissed the worst of the cracks, his lips moving against the broken skin. It was an act of worship and healing, intimate in a way that made Clara's knees weak. The sensation shot down her arm and settled low in her belly, a sudden, fierce heat that had nothing to do with the fire. He lifted his head, still holding her hands against his chest. She could feel the slow, strong thud of his heart beneath the fur and leather. "Enough," Talon whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Each winter you carry fire home yourself. You fight the cold alone. Let me keep you warm this time." Clara stared at him, her lips parted. The world narrowed down to the heat of his hands and the promise in his eyes. For 22 years, she had been the strong one, the virgin, the caretaker. No one had ever offered to take the weight. No one had ever offered simply to hold her. She leaned toward him, drawn by a gravity she could not resist. Clang, clang, clang. The sound of a bell shattered the moment. Talon stiffened instantly, his head snapping toward the road. Horses, heavy, shod hooves on the frozen earth. and the flicker of torchlight cresting the hill. "Soldiers!" Talon hissed. And Thorn! They were too close to the cabin. If Talon ran across the open snow now, he would be seen. The moon was too bright. He grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her not away from the danger, but into the deep shadow of the woodshed itself, pressing her back against the rough logs of the wall. "Quiet," he breathed. He covered her body with his own, the heavy wolf fur coat enveloping them both. He was pressed hard against her, his chest against her breasts, his thighs bracketing hers. It was necessary for concealment, but the contact was electric. Clara could feel the tension in his muscles, the heat of him seeping into her frozen clothes. She looked up, and his face was inches from hers. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, pressing her face into the fur of his collar to hide the white of her skin. They stood frozen in the dark, breaths mingling, hearts pounding in unison, as the patrol rode by not 20 yards away. Silas's voice drifted on the wind, complaining about the cold, unaware that the woman he wanted to own and the man he wanted to kill were hiding together in the dark, bound by a secret that was quickly becoming dangerous love. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It only brought a blinding, accusatory glare that reflected off the snow-covered plateau. Silas Thorne stood by the woodpile behind the Wynn cabin, his boots crunching on the frozen crust. He was not looking at the wood. He was looking at the ground. The wind had scrubbed away much of the evidence from the night before, but the ice held secrets. There were scuff marks that were too broad for a woman's boot, and in the shadow of the shed, a faint depression where a heavy knee might have pressed into the drift. Silas nudged the snow with the toe of his boot, his eyes narrowing. He did not confront Clara immediately. He was a man who set traps, not one who chased rabbits. By midday, the poison began to spread through Thorne's crossing. Silas stood on the boardwalk outside his trading post, speaking to a group of miners who were waiting for their supplies. "It is a tragedy," Silas said, his voice loud enough to carry but pitched low enough to sound confidential. "The savages are not just stealing cattle anymore. I have seen signs. They prowl around the cabins of decent folk. They lure the women." One of the miners spat tobacco juice into the street. "Lure them how?" "With witchcraft," Silas claimed smoothly, his eyes drifting toward the church where he knew Clara was cleaning the pews. "They whisper from the darkness. They promise freedom from the laws of God. They target the lonely, the pure. They seek to drag white women into the mud to soil their souls so they can never return to civilized society." The men grumbled, gripping their coat lapels tighter. It was a terrifying thought that the enemy was not just attacking their bodies, but corrupting their women. 2 days later, the trap tightened. Reverend Pike summoned Clara to the vestry after the Wednesday prayer meeting. The small room smelled of old paper and judgment. "Sit, child," Pike said, gesturing to a hard wooden chair. Clara sat, folding her hands in her lap to hide the tremors. "Is something wrong? Reverend, is it my father?" "Your father is a man burdened by past sins," Pike said, pacing behind his desk. "But it is your soul that concerns me today. Clara, Mr. Thorne has expressed grave worries." Clara stiffened. "Mr. Thorne worries about many things that are not his business." "He tells me you wander," Pike said, stopping to lean over the desk. His pale eyes bored into hers. "He tells me you spend hours in the woods, alone. He fears the influence of the wilderness is taking hold of you." "I gather wood," Clara said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Someone must—" "A husband would gather wood." Pike countered. "A husband would protect you from the shadows that stretch out from those mountains. Clara, the Navajo are not like us. They are children of the serpent. If you listen to them, if you let them near you, you are lost." He lowered his voice to a whisper. "Marry Silas. He offers you safety. He offers you a way back to the light before the darkness swallows you whole. If you refuse him, people will begin to wonder why a woman prefers the cold wind to a warm hearth. They will wonder if she has already been tainted." Clara felt the walls closing in. It was not a suggestion. It was a threat. Marry Silas, or be branded a pariah. a woman who laid with savages. High in the foothills of the Chusca Mountains, the wind was no kinder. Talon Nez sat by a small fire in the center of the hidden winter camp. His uncle, Hastian, a man with a face like a dried riverbed, sat across from him. "You smell of the White Town," Hastian said, poking the fire with a stick. "The wind carries it on your skin." Talon did not look up from the arrow shaft he was straightening. "I go where I must to watch them." "You watch one house," Hastian said sharply. "You watch the girl with hair like dry grass." Talon stopped working. He looked at his uncle. "She saved herself from the ravine. She carries burdens like a warrior. She is not like the others." "She is white," Hastian said, his voice hard. "Her people kill ours. Her father rode with the bluecoats who burned the peach orchards in the Canyon de Chelly. Fire comes from two sides, Talon, from their guns, and from her heart. If you stand in the middle, you will burn." "I am not burning," Talon said quietly. "I am seeing clearly for the first time." "Then see this," Hastian warned. "When the snow falls thickest, the wolf comes. Do not let her lead the wolf to our door." The crisis arrived with the darkening of the moon. Clara went to the trading post to buy a bottle of patent cough syrup for Elias, whose hacking was becoming violent. The store was empty, or so she thought. Silas was in the back office, the door slightly ajar. She heard the clink of glass and the rumble of male voices. "The barometer is dropping fast," a voice said. It was Captain Miller from the fort. "The scout says this will be the heaviest snow of the year. Visibility will be 0 by midnight." "Perfect," Silas Thorne's voice responded. "Nature provides the best cloak. Captain—" Clara froze, her hand hovering over a jar of peppermint sticks. She pressed herself against a stack of flour sacks, holding her breath. "Are you sure about intelligence?" the captain asked. "Absolutely," Silas lied. "My sources confirm it. The Navajo are starving. They plan to raid the storehouses tomorrow night, under the cover of the storm. They will kill anyone who stands in their way." There was a pause, the sound of liquid pouring. "Then we strike first," the captain decided. "A preventive sweep. If they are gathering to attack, they will be concentrated in the lower canyon camp. We rode out tonight at 0200 hours. We hit them while they sleep. We drive them out, or we bury them there." "Wipe them out, Captain," Silas urged. "It is the only way to secure the territory. Burn the Hogans. Leave them nowhere to hide." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. There was no raid planned. Talon had told her his people were just trying to survive the winter. Silas was fabricating a massacre to clear the land for his tannery, and he was using the United States Army as his executioner. She backed away slowly, the floorboards screaming under her boots in her imagination. Though she made no sound, she slipped out the front door and into the biting cold. She walked home in a daze. If she stayed silent, she was safe. Silas would marry her. Her father would be warm, and the Indian problem would be solved. But Talon would be dead. The man who had warmed her hands, the man who had looked at her with respect instead of possession, would be butchered in his sleep. If she warned him, she was a traitor. She could be arrested. She could be hanged. She entered the cabin. Elias was asleep, wheezing softly. Clara looked at him, then at the fire. She thought of Talon's words, "Fire is heavy, but cold is heavier." The silence of complicity was the heaviest cold of all. She moved quickly. She grabbed a heavy woolen blanket, her mother's shawl. She took the bottle of cough syrup, a pouch of dried beef, and a small knife. She put on her father's heavy coat over her own, stuffing the sleeves with rags for insulation. She kissed her father's forehead lightly. "Forgive me," she whispered. Then she opened the door and stepped into the teeth of the rising gale. The journey was a descent into hell. The storm Silas had predicted arrived with the fury of a vengeful god. The snow was not falling. It was being driven horizontally, like needles of ice. Clara fought her way toward the ridge. The familiar path was gone, erased by drifting snow that was already knee-deep. The wind screamed in her ears, drowning out her own thoughts. She had to reach the canyon. She had to find the trail Talon had used. An hour passed, then 2. Her legs burned with lactic acid. The cold found the gaps in her clothing, biting into her skin. Her eyelashes froze together, sealing her vision into a blur of gray and white. She stumbled, falling face first into a drift. The snow felt surprisingly warm, a dangerous illusion. She wanted to stay there. It would be so easy to just close her eyes. No! She forced herself up. She crawled over a ridge of rock, thinking it was the landmark she knew. It was not. The ground disappeared beneath her. She stepped out onto a cornice of snow that hung over empty air. The shelf collapsed. Clara fell, sliding down a steep scree slope, bouncing off hidden boulders. Pain exploded in her hip. She tumbled, unable to stop, the world spinning in a vortex of white. She slammed into something hard, a tree trunk jutting from the slope. The impact knocked the wind out of her. She lay there, gasping, staring up at the swirling darkness. She was lost. She was going to die here, and Talon would die too. "Help!" she croaked, the sound pathetic against the roar of the storm. A shadow detached itself from the rocks above. It moved against the wind, massive and unstoppable. Talon Nez did not ask questions. He had been patrolling the perimeter, sensing the danger in the air, when he saw the dark shape tumbling down the mountain. He slid down the slope, his boots acting as skis. He reached her, grabbing her by the coat and hauling her out of the deep snow. "You foolish woman!" he shouted over the wind, his voice raw with fear and anger. "Do you seek death so eagerly?" He dragged her toward a fissure in the rock wall, a deep, narrow crack that led into a dry cave. He pulled her inside, away from the biting wind. Clara collapsed on the sandy floor, coughing violently. Talon was instantly beside her, checking her for broken bones. His hands were shaking. "Why?" he demanded, gripping her shoulders. "Why are you here?" "They are coming," Clara gasped, grabbing the front of his tunic. Her eyes were wild, red-rimmed from the cold. "Silas! The soldiers! Tonight!" Talon went still. "Speak clearly." "I heard them," Clara choked out. "Silas told the captain you are planning a raid. He lied. He said you would attack the storehouse. The soldiers! They are riding out at 2 in the morning. A sweep. They have orders to burn everything. To kill everyone." Talon stared at her. The implication hit him like a physical blow. This white woman, this daughter of an enemy soldier, had walked through a blizzard that would kill a bear, risking her life and her standing among her own people, to save him. "You betrayed them," Talon whispered, looking at her as if he had never truly seen her before. "To save us." "I could not let the fire go out," Clara said, her voice breaking. She touched the amulet at his neck. "You kept me warm. I had to warn you." Talon sat back on his heels. He looked at the entrance of the cave, where the snow swirled like angry spirits. "We must run," Clara said, shivering. "You have to move the camp. Hide deeper in the mountains." Talon looked back at her. The anger in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "No," he said. "What?" Clara grabbed his arm. "Talon, they have Winchesters. They have horses. You cannot fight them." "If we run," Talon said, his voice low and dangerous, "Silas wins. He will tell the world we ran because we were guilty. He will say we were cowards who plotted in the dark and fled when the light came." He stood up, towering over her in the small cave. He looked like a king of the old world, proud and terrifying. "He wants a massacre in the dark," Talon said. "I will not give it to him. I will not let my people be hunted like animals." He reached down and pulled Clara to her feet. He brushed the snow from her face, his touch lingering on her cheek. "We do not run this time," Talon vowed. "If they want to kill us, they will have to do it while looking into our eyes. I want the captain to see the face of the man he came to murder." "What will you do?" Clara asked, terrified. "We will light a fire," Talon said grimly. "A fire so bright that even the blind will see the truth." He looked at her, and the distance between their worlds vanished completely. "But first," he said, "I must get you to safety. For if you are found here, they will hang you." "I am not going back," Clara said. surprising herself. She stood straighter, despite the pain in her hip. If I go back, I am just the winter virgin waiting for Silas to claim me. I am part of this now, Talon, whether you want me or not. Talon looked at her for a long, silent minute. Then, he nodded once. Then walk with me. Clara Wynne, he said. Into the fire. The wind that howled through the canyon was not merely weather. It was a living, malevolent force. It tore at the skin and blinded the eyes. A white curtain of ice crystals moving horizontally at 40 miles an hour. In the lower camp of the Navajo, the fires had been extinguished. The hogans, usually structures of warmth and song, stood silent and hollow against the gale. Talon Nez stood by the entrance of the largest structure, his face wrapped in wool, his eyes narrowed against the biting cold. He had done what was necessary. The women, the children, and the elders had been moved an hour ago, guided up a treacherous, narrow goat path to a cave system high in the cliff face, a place where horses could not follow. Now, only 6 men remained. They were the ghosts Silas Thorne had invented, made flesh. Clara Wynne stood beside Talon, her hands tucked deep into the sleeves of her father's oversized coat. She was trembling, but Talon knew it was not from the cold. "You should be up there with them," Talon shouted over the roar of the wind, gesturing toward the cliffs. "No," Clara shouted back, her voice thin but steel hard. "If I hide, I am just a rumor. If I stand here, I am a witness." Talon looked at her. The snowflake that had landed on her eyelash did not melt. She looked small against the vast backdrop of the storm, but her spirit burned with a heat that humbled him. "I cannot protect you if the shooting starts," Talon warned. "I did not come here to be protected," Clara replied. "I came to stop the shooting." A movement at the edge of the clearing caught Talon's eye. He reached for the knife at his belt, his muscles coiling. A figure was emerging from the whiteout, dragging itself forward with agonizing slowness. It was not a soldier. "Papa!" Clara gasped, the word torn from her throat. Elias Wynne looked like a specter rising from a grave. He was leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick, his bad leg dragging through the snow, leaving a furrow behind him. His face was gray, his lips blue, and his breath came in ragged, wet wheezes that rattled in his chest. Clara ran to him, grabbing his arm before he collapsed. "Papa, what are you doing? You will kill yourself." Elias leaned into her, coughing violently into a rag that came away stained with fresh blood. He looked up at Talon, his eyes watery but fierce. "I woke up," Elias wheezed, his voice barely audible. "Empty house, cold fire. I knew." He straightened himself with a groan of pain that made Clara wince. "I knew where you went, girl, and I knew what Silas was planning." He looked at Talon, man to man, soldier to warrior. "I burned the orchards in 64. I watched the smoke rise for 3 days. I will not watch it again, not while I have breath." Talon nodded, a deep, solemn acknowledgement. There was no time for apologies or forgiveness. There was only the shared enemy coming up the valley. "They will be here in less than 20 minutes, Talon said. "The wind carries the sound of iron on stone. We cannot fight them," Elias said, leaning on his stick. "Thorne has convinced the captain that you are a heavily armed war party. If you fire a single arrow, they will unleash a volley that will shred these tents." "We will not fire," Talon said. He turned to the other 5 warriors. "Gather the brush, the dry sage, and the pitch logs. Place them in the narrows, where the wind swirls against the canyon wall." Clara looked at him, confused. "You want to build a bonfire?" "No," Talon said, his eyes dark and intense. "I want to build a wall, not of stone, but of light. Silas wants a battle in the dark, where mistakes can be hidden. We will give him the sun in the middle of the night." The wait was the hardest part. The storm intensified, the visibility dropping to less than 10 feet. Clara crouched behind a boulder near the entrance of the camp, her father beside her. Elias held his old service revolver, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from the palsy of exhaustion. "Do not shoot unless I tell you," Clara whispered, gripping his arm. "I am here to die. Clara." Elias murmured, staring into the white void. "But I am here to die on the right side this time." Then they heard it, the muffled snort of a horse, the clink of a saber against a saddle, the low, cursing voices of men miserable in the cold. Silas Thorne's voice cut through the wind. "Keep moving. The scouts saw movement here. They are hunkered down, likely drunk on their own spirits. We catch them sleeping." The column of riders materialized from the snow like phantoms. There were at least 30 of them, blue-coated cavalrymen with carbines resting on their thighs, flanked by a dozen rough-looking men in civilian clothes. Silas rode at the front, beside a grim-faced officer. They reached the bottleneck of the canyon, just 50 yards from the first hogan. "Deploy skirmishers," the officer shouted. "Prepare to now." Talon's voice boomed from the darkness. A single flaming arrow arced through the sky, a streak of orange against the gray. It landed not on a man, but into a massive pile of resin-soaked tumbleweeds and pine boughs that the warriors had stacked along the canyon walls. Whoosh! The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The accelerant caught, and the wind, funneling through the canyon, fanned the flames into a sudden, roaring curtain of fire. It did not block the path, but it illuminated the entire valley floor with a brilliance that blinded the night-adjusted eyes of the soldiers. The horses screamed, rearing back in panic at the sudden inferno. The formation broke. Men shouted, fighting to control their mounts. Hold your fire!" the officer bellowed, his horse spinning in circles. In the sudden, stark light of the fire, the army Silas had promised was revealed. There were no entrenched riflemen. There were no fortifications. 6 Navajo men stood in a line before the empty hogans. They held no rifles. They held no bows. In their hands, they held willow branches tied with white cloth, the universal sign of parley, and sacred prayer sticks decorated with eagle feathers. They stood motionless, statues of bronze against the fire, staring silently at the guns pointed at their chests. The soldiers froze. It is one thing to shoot into the dark at a screaming enemy. It is another to gun down unarmed men standing in prayer. "What is this?" the officer, Captain Miller, shouted, staring at the tableau. "Thorne! You said they were dug in. You said they were armed for a raid." Silas Thorne's face was twisted in a rictus of panic and rage. The firelight cast deep shadows in the hollows of his skull, making him look like a demon. "It is a trick," Silas screamed, pulling his heavy revolver. "They are luring you in. Shoot them before they signal the others." He raised his gun, aiming directly at Talon, who stood in the center of the line, his chest exposed. "Stop!" The scream was high and pierced through the wind. Clara Wynne stepped out from behind the boulder. She walked straight into the space between the soldiers and the warriors. She had wrapped a Navajo blanket around her shoulders, the red wool vivid against the snow. "Clara," Silas lowered his gun slightly, his jaw dropping. "Get out of the way. They have taken her hostage." "I am no hostage," Clara yelled, her voice breaking with the force of her lungs. She walked until she stood next to Talon, her shoulder brushing his arm. She looked up at the captain. "There is no raid." "Captain Miller," Clara shouted. "There is no stolen grain. Look around you. Where are the stockpiles? Where are the weapons?" "She is bewitched," Silas roared, spurring his horse forward. "The savages have turned her mind. Don't listen to her." "I am not bewitched. I am awake." Clara pointed an accusing finger at Silas. "He brought you here to commit murder. He wants the water rights to this canyon for a tannery. He wants to poison the stream that feeds the valley." The soldiers murmured, lowering their rifles slightly. The captain looked from Clara to Silas, doubt creeping into his eyes. "Captain," Clara continued, desperate, "Silas told you there were raiders, but my father and I have watched this camp. There are only families here, starving families trying to survive the winter. Your father is a senile old fool," Silas spat. "My father is a hero," Clara screamed. Elias stepped into the light. He hobbled forward, his cane sinking into the snow. He looked small and frail, but he wore his faded army coat with the brass buttons. He stopped beside his daughter. "Captain Miller," Elias said, his voice raspy but projecting with the authority of a veteran. I served with the 3rd Cavalry. I know a war party when I see one. This is not war, this is an execution. He turned his gaze on Silas. And I know a thief when I see one. Silas, the cattle you said were stolen, I saw your men driving them south to the Bucks Canyon 2 nights ago. You staged the thefts to get the army to do your dirty work. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and damning. Liar, Silas shrieked. The facade of the respectable businessman shattered completely. He was a cornered animal now, his greed exposed in the flickering firelight. You are all against me. You would side with these animals against your own kind. My kind does not shoot unarmed men, Elias said calmly. Silas's eyes went wild. He realized the soldiers were not going to fire. He realized his plan was dissolving into ash. He raised his gun again, leveling it not at the warriors, but at the man who was destroying his life. He aimed at Talon. No! Clara screamed, diving toward Talon, but Elias was faster. Or perhaps he'd been waiting for this moment since he walked into the snow. The old soldier threw himself forward, stepping into the line of fire just as Silas squeezed the trigger. Bang! The shot cracked like thunder in the canyon. Elias spun around, the impact throwing him back into the snow. A dark bloom of blood exploded on his left shoulder. Papa! Clara shrieked, dropping to her knees beside him. For a second, there was absolute silence. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, Talon moved. He did not run. He exploded from his stillness like a released spring. He covered the 20 feet between him and Silas's horse in 2 seconds. Silas tried to cock the hammer for a second shot, but Talon was there. The Navajo warrior leaped, grabbing Silas by the coat and dragging him out of the saddle. They hit the frozen ground with a bone-jarring thud. Silas was a big man, heavy with muscle and fat, but Talon was fighting with the fury of generations. Silas flailed, trying to bring the gun to bear, but Talon slammed his wrist against a rock. The revolver skittered away into the darkness. Talon pinned Silas to the ground, his forearm pressing against the traitor's throat. With his other hand, Talon drew the hunting knife from his belt. The blade caught the firelight, gleaming orange and deadly. "Do it!" a young soldier shouted in panic, raising his carbine. "Hold your fire!" Captain Miller roared, riding his horse between his men and the brawl. Talon held the knife inches from Silas's eye. Silas was gasping, clawing at Talon's arm, his eyes bulging with terror. "Please," Silas wheezed. "Please, don't." Talon looked down at him. He could feel the pulse of the man's jugular beneath his arm. It would be so easy. One stroke. Justice for the land. Justice for the insults. Justice for Clara's father bleeding in the snow. He looked up. Clara was pressing a scarf to her father's wound, but she was looking at Talon. Her eyes were wide, terrified, not that he would die, but that he would become a murderer. Talon's grip on the knife tightened until his knuckles turned white. He looked at Captain Miller, who sat on his horse with his pistol drawn but not raised. "You call us savages," Talon said, his voice low but carrying over the wind. "You say we have no law, no God." He stood up slowly, stepping back from the gasping Silas. He reversed the knife in his hand and drove it violently into the frozen earth, leaving it quivering there. "I will not dirty my blade with the blood of a coward," Talon said. He looked at the captain. "He shot a white veteran. He lied to a United States officer. He tried to murder unarmed men." Talon spread his arms wide, his chest a broad target against the fire. "So tell me, Captain, who is the savage here? Is it the man who protects his home or the man who kills for gold?" Captain Miller stared at Talon. He looked at Silas, who was scrambling in the snow like a rat, trying to reach his fallen gun. "Corporal," Miller barked. "Secure Mr. Thorne." "What?" Silas cried, as 2 soldiers jumped down and grabbed his arms. "Captain, you can't be serious. I'm a citizen. These are hostiles. You are under arrest. Thorne," Miller said, his voice cold as the ice around them. "For the attempted murder of Elias Wynne, and for filing false reports to the United States Army. If that man dies, the charge is murder." Miller looked at Talon. He holstered his pistol. It was a small gesture, but it signaled the end of the war in that canyon. Check the wounded man, Miller ordered his medic. The medic ran to where Clara was kneeling. Elias was conscious, his face pale as the snow, but he was grinning weakly. Missed the heart, Elias rasped, looking at Clara. Lousy shot. Always was, Clara sobbed, a sound of pure relief, and buried her face in his good shoulder. Talon walked over to them. He knelt on one knee in the snow. He did not touch Clara, but his presence was a shelter. He looked at Elias. You have a warrior's heart, old man, Talon said softly. Elias looked up at the Navajo. And you have a damn lot of patience for a young buck. Captain Miller rode closer. He looked at the empty hogans, then at the firewall that was beginning to die down. My orders were to clear this canyon, Miller said, sounding tired. He looked at the map case on his saddle, then pulled out the paper with his orders. He crumpled it in his gloved hand. However, Miller said loud enough for his men to hear, due to the extreme weather conditions and faulty intelligence provided by local guides, the mission was aborted. We are returning to the fort. He looked at Talon. This is temporary. You understand the bureaucrats in Washington will draw new lines in the spring. I cannot promise you this land forever. I do not ask forever, Talon said, standing up. I ask for tonight. Miller nodded. He turned his horse. Mount up, we ride. The soldiers, relieved not to be killing civilians in a blizzard, mounted their horses. They hauled a screaming, protesting Silas Thorne onto a spare horse, tying his hands to the saddle horn. As the column began to move out, turning back into the storm, the snow began to fall softer. The wind lost its scream, dropping to a low whistle. Clara remained kneeling in the snow, her hands covered in her father's blood, but her eyes were fixed on Talon. He stood guard over them, the firelight fading, the darkness returning. But the fear was gone. The storm still raged, but the war, at least this battle of it, was over. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured clean and buried under 3 feet of silence. The sun that rose over the canyon was brilliant and hard, reflecting off the snow with a glare that forced the eyes to squint. Inside the hogan of Hastian, the air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and the pungent, earthy smell of crushed globe mallow roots. It was a warm, circular womb of a room. The logs chinked with red mud that held the heat of the central fire. Elias Wynne lay on a bed of sheepskins, his left shoulder bound tightly in clean linen strips soaked in a dark, herbal poultice. He was awake, his eyes tracing the pattern of the roof logs spiraling upward toward the smoke hole. He had expected to die. When he had stepped in front of Silas's gun, he had made his peace with the Almighty. He certainly had not expected to wake up in the home of the enemy, being spoon-fed broth by a woman whose grandmother might have been in the village he had helped burn 15 years ago. An elderly Navajo woman, her face a map of deep wrinkles, knelt beside him. She did not speak English, but her hands were gentle as she checked the dressing on his wound. She clicked her tongue, satisfied that the bleeding had stopped, and offered him a clay cup. Drink, a voice said from the doorway. Elias turned his head stiffly. Talon Nez stood there, ducking his head to enter the low door. He looked tired, circles of exhaustion bruising the skin beneath his eyes. But he carried himself with the easy grace of a man who was no longer hunting or being hunted. It is willowbark tea, Talon explained, crossing to the fire. It tastes like old boots, but it stops the fever. Elias took the cup, his hand trembling slightly. He drank the bitter liquid without grimacing. I have drunk worse in the army canteens, he rasped. He lowered the cup and looked at the warrior. Why am I here, Talon? Why not leave me for the army surgeon? The army surgeon is 3 hours away in deep snow, Talon said, crouching to stir the fire. And you lost a lot of blood. If we had moved you, you would be a frozen corpse by now. Elias looked at the old woman, who was now humming softly as she ground corn in a stone metate. She knows, doesn't she? She knows I was a bluecoat. She knows, Talon said simply. She also knows you took a bullet meant for one of us. In our way, a life debt cancels a blood debt. You are safe here, old man. Elias lay back, closing his eyes. The irony was a heavy weight on his chest. The people he had demonized to justify his own sins were the ones stitching him back together. Outside, the air was crisp enough to snap a twig. Clara Wynne sat on a log near the communal fire, her hands busy. She was not idle. Idleness was a sin in this camp, not a religious one, but a survival one. She was learning to husk the dried blue corn, imitating the rhythm of the young Navajo girl sitting opposite her. At first, her fingers had been clumsy, fumbling with the tough outer leaves, but after 3 days, she had found the cadence. Rip, twist, snap. She was no longer wearing her heavy, sodden woolen skirts. They were drying from the fire. Instead, she wore a borrowed buckskin skirt and leggings, softer and warmer than anything she had ever owned. Her hair was braided back in the Navajo style to keep it out of the smoke. She was not a prisoner. She was not quite a guest. She was something new, a curiosity that was slowly becoming a fixture. The elders watched her. Hastian, Talon's uncle, sat on his blanket in the sun, smoking a pipe. His eyes followed Clara as she worked. He had expected the white woman to weep, to demand special treatment, or to faint at the sight of butchered game. Instead, he saw her carry water from the spring, breaking the ice with a rock. He saw her tending to her father with a fierce devotion. He watched Talon walk over to her. Talon did not speak immediately. He picked up a cob of corn and began to work beside her. It was a small thing, a domestic thing, but in the open view of the village, it was a declaration. "Your hands are bleeding again," Talon observed quietly. Clara looked down. The cold, dry air had reopened one of the cracks on her thumb. "It is nothing. The corn is rough." Talon reached into his pouch and pulled out a small tin of salve mutton tallow mixed with pine resin. He took her hand, stopping her work. He did not care that Hastian was watching. He rubbed the salve into her skin, his thumb moving in slow, deliberate circles. "The army has gone," Talon said, his voice low. "But word has come from the trading post. A government man has arrived from Santa Fe. An agent. He wants to speak." Clara looked up, fear tightening her chest. "About Silas. About everything," Talon said. "About the water, about the land, about us." He paused. "They want you to come too. They say they need a witness who speaks the tongue of the white man, but understands the truth." "I am not a diplomat, Talon," Clara said. "I am just—" "You are the woman who walked through a blizzard to stop a war." Talon interrupted. "You are more than they deserve." The news of the aborted raid and Silas Thorne's arrest had hit the settlement of Thorne's Crossing like a hammer blow. The vacuum of power left the town reeling. Reverend Pike stood in the empty sanctuary of his church. The sunlight filtered through the dust motes, illuminating the empty pews. For years, he had preached that civilization was the light and the wilderness was the darkness. He had preached that men like Silas Thorne were the shepherds of progress. Now, he knew that the shepherd had been a wolf, and the savages he had condemned had shown a mercy that shamed his flock. He walked to the window and looked out at the snowy street. He saw Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Pike standing by the livery stable, their heads close together, whispering. They were not praying. They were dissecting the scandal. "They say she is living in a mud hut." "Mrs." Pike whispered, her voice carrying on the thin air. "Sleeping on skins, probably eating raw meat." "And the father, Mrs.?" Miller asked. "Bewitched, Mrs." Pike declared. "Or dead. Who knows what they do to their captives?" Reverend Pike turned away from the window. He felt a sudden, violent nausea. He had fed these women the poison they were now spitting. He walked to the altar and picked up his Bible. He opened it, looking for comfort, but the pages felt dry and brittle. "Truth," he whispered to the empty room. "The truth shall set you free." But the truth he was finding was a jagged pill to swallow. The meeting took place 2 days later, not in the fort, but on the porch of the trading post, neutral ground. The snow had been cleared, but the air remained freezing. A long table had been set up. On one side sat Captain Miller and a man in a pinstripe suit that looked ridiculous in the rugged landscape. Mr. Arthur Sterling, the representative from the Department of the Interior. On the other side Standing because they refused to sit in the chairs provided were Talon, Hastian, and 2 other clan leaders, and between them sat Clara. She wore her own dress again, cleaned and pressed, but she kept the Navajo blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the cold. She felt the eyes of the town on her. The women stood in clusters by the general store, watching. The men leaned against the saloon porch, smoking and spitting. Silas Thorne was nowhere to be seen. He was currently in a cell at Fort Union, awaiting transport to Santa Fe for trial. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Sterling said, adjusting his spectacles. He looked at the Navajo delegation with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "We usually conduct these affairs at the agency office." "The agency office is 2 days away," Captain Miller said sharply. "And we have a peace to secure here and now. Mr. Sterling, before the snow melts and the shooting starts again." Sterling sighed and opened a ledger. "Very well. The Army report states that the hostilities were instigated by false intelligence provided by the traitor, Silas Thorne. The government acknowledges this error." He looked up. "However, the issue of water rights remains. This land is technically unmarked territory, but it borders the reservation." Talon stepped forward. He spoke in Navajo, his voice resonant and deep, carrying the cadence of the mountains. He spoke of the spring, of the generations who had watered their sheep there, of the winter camp that was vital for survival. Sterling looked blankly at Captain Miller. "What is he saying? I do not speak the dialect." Miller looked at Clara. "Miss Wynne." Clara stood up. Her knees were shaking, but her voice was clear. She did not just translate the words. She translated the emotion. "He says the water is not a line on a map," Clara said, looking at Sterling. "He says the spring is the blood of the canyon. To cut it off is to kill the body. He says they do not ask to own the mountain, for no man can own the rock. They ask only to live as they have lived, without fences that starve their children." Sterling blinked. He looked at Talon again, seeing him perhaps for the first time as a man and not a statistic. We can designate the canyon as a temporary grazing allotment," Sterling conceded, writing in his book, "Protected status. No commercial development, that means no tannery pending a formal treaty review in Washington." He looked up. "But there are conditions. The raids on cattle must stop completely, and the trading post must be allowed to operate under new management without harassment." Talon listened as Clara translated. He nodded once. "We do not eat cattle when the deer are plentiful, and we have no quarrel with a trader who uses scales that are balanced. It was a deal. It was not a perfect victory. The land was still allotted rather than recognized as sovereign, but it was survival. It was the future." As the meeting adjourned, Clara felt a wave of exhaustion hit her. She stepped off the porch, feeling the eyes of the townswomen boring into her back. "Look at her," she heard a hiss, standing there with them like she is one of the tribe, shaming her mother's memory. "I heard she shared a blanket with the buck," another voice whispered. "She is ruined. No decent man will touch her now." Clara kept her head high, but the words were like small, sharp stones. Then she saw something else. Near the corner of the livery stable, 3 young girls were watching her. They were 14 or 15, the age Clara had been when she first felt the cage of the town closing around her. They were not whispering. They were staring with wide, awestruck eyes. They looked at Clara, the woman who had defied the richest man in town, who had ridden with warriors, who had spoken to the government agent with a voice of iron, and they did not see a ruined woman. They saw a hero. One of the girls gave a small, shy wave. Clara smiled, a genuine, tired smile. She realized then that she did not care about the whispers of the old. She had sparked a fire in the young. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of violet and rose. The crowd had dispersed. Captain Miller and Mr. Sterling had retreated to the warmth of the officers' mess tent. Clara stood by the hitching rail where Talon was checking the cinch on his horse. Her father was still at the village, too weak to travel yet, but he would recover. "It is done," Talon said, looking at the document in his hand, a copy of the agreement. "For now." Clara said. She looked at the cabin on the hill, her home. It looked small and dark. Then she looked toward the mountains, where the smoke of the hogans rose into the twilight. A sudden, crushing sense of displacement washed over her. She realized she could not go back to being the Clara she was before. She could not be the winter virgin carrying wood alone, enduring the pity of the town. That woman had died in the snowstorm, but she also knew she was not Navajo. She could learn to grind corn. She could speak the words, but she did not share the blood or the history of the spirits that walked the canyon. "Where do I go?" "Talon," she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. Talon stopped his work. He turned to her, resting his arm on the saddle. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the terrifying freedom of having no place to land. "If I stay here," Clara said, her voice trembling, "I suffocate. I will be the pariah they whisper about. But if I go with you, I lose myself. I lost the part of me that is my father, my books, my God." She looked at him, pleading for an answer. Can a person live in two worlds? Talon stepped closer. He did not touch her, but his presence wrapped around her like the buffalo robe. "The creek," Talon said, gesturing to the water that ran through the valley, separating the town from the wild lands. "It touches both banks. It does not choose one side. It flows between them, and it makes life possible for both." He looked deep into her eyes. "You do not have to become Navajo, Clara, and I will never be a white man. If you try to be me, you will disappear. If I try to be you, I will die." He reached out and took her hand, the hand that was still healing, but strong. "Do not choose a side," Talon said, his voice rough with the promise of the future. "We will build something new, something that sits on the line, a place where the fire is shared." He squeezed her hand. "The town is too small for you now, and the hogan is too smoky for your books. So, we make a place in the middle, a place where the door opens to the east for the Navajo sun, but the windows look west for the white man's sunset." Clara looked at the empty stretch of land near the bend in the creek, the no man's land between the settlement and the reservation line. It was covered in snow now, but she could see it, a cabin, a corral, a bridge. "A place in the middle," she repeated, tasting the words. "Yes," Talon said. He lifted her hand and pressed it to his chest, over his heart. "And I will be there to keep the fire lit every winter." Clara took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. It no longer smelled of fear. It smelled of pine, of snow, and of a beginning. "Then let us go," Clara said. "We have wood to gather." The thaw arrived in the high country, not with a whisper, but with the roar of the Rio Grande swelling in the distance. The ice that had choked the Box Canyon for 5 long months began to groan and fracture, sending sheets of white drifting downstream like the discarded armor of a defeated army. By the time the purple sage began to bloom in the spring of 1879, the landscape between Thorns Crossing and the Navajo reservation line had changed. It was no longer a barren no-man's land of sagebrush and suspicion. On a flat rise of land, sheltered by a stand of cottonwoods near the creek, a structure had risen. It was not a cabin, nor was it a hogan. It was a testament to compromise. The walls were hewn from ponderosa pine logs, stacked square in the manner of the white settlers, sturdy against the wind. But the roof was different. It was domed, packed thick with red earth and cedar bark, built to breathe with the seasons in the style of the Dina. The door faced east to greet the rising sun, as tradition demanded. But glass windows looked west, capturing the twilight that Clara loved. Clara Wynne stood by the new corral, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. She was no longer the pale, fragile creature who had shivered in the church pew. Her skin was bronzed by the sun, and her arms, revealed by rolled-up sleeves, were muscled from months of lifting stone and timber. She watched Talon Nez working on the fence line. He was shirtless, his skin gleaming with sweat as he drove a cedar post into the softening earth. He worked with a rhythm that was efficient and beautiful, a man who moved in harmony with the physical world. He paused, sensing her eyes on him, and looked up. The wariness that had once defined his gaze was gone, replaced by a steady, quiet warmth. "The soil is good here," Talon said, resting his hand on the post. "We will plant corn in the lower wash next month, and squash near the house. And flowers," Clara added, leaning against the rail. "I want hollyhocks by the door. My mother always said a house without flowers is just a box to sleep in." Talon smiled, a slow curving of his lips that still made Clara's breath hitch. "Then we will plant hollyhocks, and they will likely be the stubborn flowers in New Mexico, if they take after their gardener." It was a small moment, utterly mundane, yet, for Clara, it was a miracle. She was standing in the open, speaking of the future with a Navajo warrior, and the sky did not fall. A few hundred yards downstream, a smaller structure sat near the water. It was a humble lean-to, patched together with scrap lumber and enthusiasm. Elias Wynne sat on a stump outside, his bad legs stretched out in the sun. He looked older, his hair completely white now, but the gray pallor of death had left his face. He held a slate tablet in his lap. Sitting cross-legged in the grass around him were 4 Navajo children, their dark eyes wide with concentration. "Tree," Elias said, tapping the slate where he had drawn a crude pine. "Can you say it, tree?" "Sin," a small boy replied instantly in Navajo. Giggling. "Yes, Ditsin," Elias agreed, nodding respectfully. "But in the white man's tongue, it is a tree, Trduree. He wrote the letters slowly. The children leaned in. Elias looked up and saw Clara watching him from the main house. He waved his hand. He had spent his life using a language as a weapon, translating orders that sent men to their deaths. Now, he was using it to build small bridges, one word at a time. He was learning, too. The children taught him the names of the birds and the rocks. He had learned that in their language. You did not just say you owned a thing, you said you were in relationship with it. It was a lesson he wished he had learned 40 years ago. As the months turned toward summer, the cabin between the worlds became a hub. It started slowly. A miner's wife from the settlement, desperate because the new trader in town had raised prices on flour, came knocking at Clara's door. She had been terrified, clutching her shawl tight, eyeing Talon with suspicion. Clara had invited her in, sat her at the table, and sold her flour from their own winter stock at a fair price. Talon had given the woman a bundle of dried Ota wild tea for her husband's cough. The woman had left confused but grateful. 2 days later, she returned with her sister. By midsummer, the cabin at the creek had become an unofficial trading post for the outcasts of both societies. The poor white families who could not afford the company's store prices found they could trade labor or eggs for goods. The Navajo families, wary of the town, found they could bring their woven rugs and silverwork to Talon without fear of being cheated or insulted. It was not a utopia. There were still men in town who spat when Clara's name was mentioned. There were still young braves who called Talon a traitor for living under a square roof, but the commerce flowed, and with it, a grudging respect. One Sunday afternoon, a buggy rattled down the overgrown track leading to the creek. Clara was shelling peas on the porch when she saw the black coat and the stiff brim hat. Reverend Pike climbed down from the buggy. He looked diminished. His coat was dusty, and he seemed to have shrunk inside his skin. He walked up the path, holding a burlap sack in one hand and a black book in the other. Talon stepped out of the house, drying his hands on a rag. He stood beside Clara, not aggressively, but solid as an oak. "Reverend?" Clara said, standing up. She did not offer him a seat immediately. She waited. Pike looked at the house, then at Talon, and finally at Clara. He cleared his throat, but the thunderous voice of the pulpit was gone. "I brought corn," Pike said, holding out the sack. "From the church garden. It is a good harvest this year. Too much for the parsonage." It was a peace offering. A clumsy one, but an offering nonetheless. Talon stepped forward and took the sack. "Thank you. We will grind it." Pike shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. He fingered the spine of his Bible. "I have been reading, Clara, the passages about judgment, about the Pharisees." He looked up, his eyes watery. I preached that the wilderness was the enemy. I preached that Mr. Thorne was a pillar of the community because he sat in the front pew and paid his tithes. He shook his head. Silas Thorne sits in a cell in Santa Fe, charged with 3 counts of attempted murder, and the man I called a savage. He looked at Talon. The man I called a savage spared the life of the one who tried to kill him. Pike took a breath. Perhaps the Lord does not hate the Navajo. Clara, perhaps he hates the liars who use his name to hide their greed. It was not a full apology. Men like Pike did not know how to fully apologize, but it was a crack in the dam. "Come inside, Reverend," Clara said softly. "The coffee is fresh." The evenings were for learning. When the work was done, and the fire was lit in the hearth, the education began. Clara sat at the heavy wooden table, the light of the oil lamp casting a golden circle on the surface. She held a pen, scratching ink onto good paper. She was writing a letter to the headmistress of a teaching college in St. Louis, to Mrs. Sterling. She wrote, "You asked for stories of the frontier for your history primer. Do not tell the children about the cowboys who conquered the wild. Tell them about the people who were already here, who knew the names of the mountains before we ever drew them on a map. Tell them that courage is not just charging into battle. It is standing in the snow without a weapon, holding a white flag because you believe peace is worth dying for." She would not sign her name. She did not want fame. She wanted the truth to survive. Across the table, Talon sat with a primer book. His large, scarred hands that could string a bow with deadly precision, were clumsy as they held the small book. "CAT," Talon read slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Cat, good," Clara said, smiling. "And the next one, HOUSE. Talon sounded out. "House." He looked up at her. "This is hard work. Snow woman. Harder than breaking a horse. But it opens the world," Clara said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "Then I will teach you." Talon said. He closed the book. "Listen," he began to sing. It was a low, rhythmic chant, rising from his chest. It was a song of the night chant, a song about the balance between the earth and the sky, between the male rain and the female rain. He taught her the words, breaking down the complex sounds until they rolled off her tongue. They sat there late into the night, trading words, trading worlds, weaving a new language that belonged only to them. The seasons turned, the cottonwoods dropped their gold, and the wind began to sharpen. The sky turned the color of steel. Winter had returned. It was the first night of the true cold. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, testing the logs, looking for a weakness. Clara stood by the hearth, adding a log to the fire. She paused, looking at her hands. They were rougher now than they had been a year ago. There were new scars, new calluses, but they were steady. She put on her coat, a heavy sheepskin coat Talon had made for her, and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" Talon asked from the table where he was mending a bridle. "To the woodpile," Clara said. "We need more for the night." She stepped out into the biting cold. The snow was falling softly, coating the world in silence. She walked to the stacked cords of wood they had cut together in the autumn. She bent down, gathering an armful of piñón. The weight was familiar. The bite of the cold on her cheeks was familiar. For a moment, she was back there, the lonely spinster, the winter virgin, bracing herself against the crushing weight of solitude. She lifted the wood, turning back toward the house. Talon was there. He had followed her out, silent as the snow itself. He stood in her path, blocking the wind. He did not take the wood from her immediately. He looked at her, his eyes dark and shining in the starlight. "It is heavy," Talon said. "I can carry it," Clara replied, the old reflex kicking in. "I know you can." Talon said, "You can carry the whole world if you have to." "Clara, that is why I love you." He stepped closer, reaching out. He did not take the wood. He took her hands, still clutching the rough bark. He covered her cold fingers with his warm ones. He lifted her hands, wood and all, and pressed his lips to her knuckles. He kissed the scar where the axe had slipped in the summer. He kissed the callus on her palm. "But you do not have to," he whispered against her skin. "I told you once, and I tell you now. This winter, and every winter after this, I will keep you warm." Clara felt the heat of him seep through her gloves, through her skin, and into the marrow of her bones. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 10 years. She let the tension drain from her shoulders. She allowed him to take the weight. Talon took the wood from her arms effortlessly. He held it in one arm and wrapped his other arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. "Come," he said. "The fire is inside." They walked back to the house together, two silhouettes against the white ground, leaving a single, wide path in the snow. Epilogue. The years rolled on, as they do in the high desert, marked not by calendars but by the height of the corn and the depth of the snow. Travelers passing through the region in the winter of 1880 would often pause on the ridge overlooking the valley. They would see a strange sight. Down below, where the smoke curled from a chimney that belonged to neither the town nor the tribe, a couple would be walking. A woman, tall and strong, walked through the drifts with a bundle of kindling on her shoulder. She walked with a stride that was free and unburdened, and beside her, matching her step for step, was a tall Navajo man. Sometimes, the man would reach out and take a log from her bundle if she stumbled. Sometimes, she would reach out and brush the snow from his hair. But mostly, they just walked side by side, and if the wind was quiet enough, the travelers on the ridge would hear something that had never been heard in that canyon before. They would hear laughter. It was not the polite laughter of the parlor, nor the raucous laughter of the saloon. It was the deep, resonant laughter of two people who had looked into the face of the freezing dark and found a fire that could not be extinguished. The winter virgin carried firewood no more. Clara Nez carried the fire itself, and she was never, ever cold again. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the snow and the fire, and I hope Clara and Talon's story warmed your heart as much as it did mine. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you are listening from. Are you curled up by a fire, driving on a long road, or just taking a break from your day? Let's share our stories in the comments section. If you enjoyed this tale of the American West, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Don't forget to hit the like button and smash that hype button so this story can reach more listeners and we can keep the spirit of these stories alive. Thank you for your support, and until the next campfire,